I'm Julia, marketer by day and a big literary enthusiast by night. And I have been very, very pleased to be working on the Romanian translation, at least the getting it out to the readers bit of Starling House, which is why we're here talking to Alix E Harrow about it. I have the Romanian version too. It has the same lovely cover as the English version. So yes, thank you so much for
Thank you
taking the
so
time.
much for having me. I'm very excited to get to do this.
There's already a fan base in Romania, so Darling House has been greatly anticipated. So I'm sure this will be received very well once it's out there. And I will start off with asking if there's any books or films or anything that inspired Starling House. I know there's a very personal element to it, but if there's anything else.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny because I really do think of myself as a reader first and a writer just incidentally. And so like every book that I write is deeply shaped by all the books that shaped me, right? So like this is not just kind of from one book or influence, but it's the product of all the books that
Mm,
like it's talking to Southern Gothic and like pulpy Gothics, and a little bit fairy tale retellings, so like there's a huge number of influences in there. But actually, probably the biggest one is not a book, but a song, and a
mhm.
songwriter. I'm actually just by chance I am holding my John Prine mug. Uh, which I don't, he's not even that well known really in my country, but he was well known in my childhood. He's a sort
Mhm.
of Kentucky singer-songwriter, folk singer. And he has this famous song about the town of Paradise, Kentucky, which was a real town that was destroyed in the 1960s by a coal-fired power plant that sort of made the air and water so toxic that people could no longer live there. And so all that exists today of the town of Paradise is a graveyard. And so Starling House kind of came out of, and that was only like the next county over from me. So I grew up knowing the story and knowing that place. And so Starling House kind of started as like a what if alternative history of paradise. You see, I named mine Eden, you see?
Mhm.
Like, what if that town had existed, continued to exist, and what it would look like today?
Got to talk to the translator who discovered the song by
Oh, yeah.
accident while working on the translation. So it was like very
I mean,
funny.
there's so many. I really do wonder about the process of translation for this book more than the other ones because it's so Kentucky specific and there's like a lot of little references. Like somebody told me that the French edition has footnotes to explain what a Waffle House is and what a Dollar General is. And I was like, I don't really know how the specificity of like my childhood in Western rural Kentucky looks to the rest of the
Yeah,
world.
there's footnotes to the already existing footnotes in the Romanian version too. So
Well, I'm sorry. I hope it translates.
since we've already sort of started talking about Starling House and the house itself and Eden and everything, the house and the character of Starling House carries all this sort of weight of history, all the secrets and the trauma, and there's all the echoes of sort of the slavery that built the town of Eden. How did you find sort of balancing the writing of a Gothic story with honoring what we all now know is a sort of very real background and
Yeah.
happening?
Well, I think what's great about it, that's why it had to be a Gothic. I think the Gothic as a genre is the genre that is built as a toolbox to sort of reckon with the past, right? So, like, even its supernatural elements are ones that are about sort of the sins of the past, things that are like coming home to roost, right? That's the nature of
Mhm.
ghosts, the nature of a haunted house is sort of like there is something that happened before you arrived here that is lingering, that is poisoning.
Hmm.
It's sort of a family curse idea. Like all of these tropes of the Gothic are about what we inherit and why. And so that's, I think, one reason that it is such a enduringly popular genre to talk about the American South about, you
Hmm.
know?
Hmm.
Because it's also just literally true in the landscape. So there's these things that are tropes in fiction, and then there's just the facts of it, which is that if there is an old house and a very large old house, like a mansion, something that was
Hmm.
built with a lot of money pre-Civil War in the American South, that money only really ever came from one place. And we all know that, so you walk around with that knowledge, and it is sort of figuratively haunted, but also literally haunted by the past.
Difficult, but sort of
But it's
very,
all kind of right there, like I didn't have
yeah.
to make it. There's not a lot of imagination or invention there because it's in a lot of ways just a very slight exaggeration or a literalization of what is just
Hmm.
there, obvious in the
Hmm.
landscape.
Fair, fair. Thing that's been mentioned, the ghosts and sort of the death in the story is not only literary ghosts and the death, so not in the traditional horror sense. How do you see the role of ghosts and the past in shaping the present, which is very
Yeah.
present in the
Well,
book?
that's exactly like what you get to do with the Gothic, and I think fantasy more generally. One of the
Mm,
reasons I like it so much is that you can take things that in realistic fiction would be invisible or
mhm,
subtext,
mhm.
and you can make them visible and literal. So I do think like just to state the very obvious that like our present is deeply shaped is a product of the past, right? And so like to
Yes.
write, I was like feeling very brave. I was like, ooh, I'm gonna write a contemporary book rather than historical fiction,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
maybe I won't have to do so much research. But it turns out the way that I see the world is that you don't understand your present unless you've gone, like 6 generations back. So it involved a lot of like the history of what happened to this town and trying to incorporate both trying to make it sound like a an oral story or like a fairy tale or a
Mhm.
fable, but also to incorporate the true things that did happen in that actual county that I know about.
Opal herself um, ends up doing all this research of Starling House, even though, she's right there. I will sort of jump to her and like focus on her because I really liked Opal as a protagonist. I'm also a big sister who feels the need to like dote on her younger brother and
And
my
they don't need it as much as you
no,
think that they
no,
do.
no. And we've also like lived apart. So my whole thing of like, oh my God, I need to be there for him and like, you know, the
Hmm.
big sisterly thing like really,
Hmm.
really hit me. Besides everything else, that she's independent and so complex. How did she sort of take shape in your mind? I
Yeah.
imagine again there's that personal part.
Yeah. But I never know about the personal part until I write it. I always think I'm
Mhm,
doing something that is like an intentional argument about the genre, right? So I was like, the traditional Gothic female
mhm,
protagonist, at least in a certain tradition of pulpy Gothics, is very like this innocent and this naive young girl who goes to this dark mansion and like maybe falls in love with this terrible man. Or, she is sort of seduced into this different world and she doesn't really know what she's in for. And so I really wanted a Gothic protagonist who knew exactly what was up. Like I
mhm,
wanted a less
mhm,
innocent,
mhm,
less naive, tougher, angrier, um, not to say that she wouldn't be seduced by this guy or this world, but that she knows what she's about and
mhm,
that she's
mhm,
making these choices. I also think the Gothic is doing really interesting class things about like the appeal of wealth, but also the evil of wealth and like the longing for something that you know is bad. And so I wanted to play with class a lot more intentionally. So I had all these like arguments I was doing with her character, but then of course it turns out that I just wrote her to be like a kid who grew up around the poverty line in rural Kentucky and had a younger sibling that she felt very responsible for. I have two little brothers. I'm about 8 years older than them. So I was very they live across the street from me right now. Um, so I obviously put a lot more of myself into her than I maybe planned on.
I did like the fact that sort of as a fantasy enthusiast, I saw Beauty and the Beast. Like Beauty goes and there's the Beast and he lives in his house all by himself, but without, all the
I know.
problematic.
And then people are complaining to me. They're like, why did you make Arthur ugly? And I'm like, come on now. We've been raised on Beauty and the Beast stories. I thought you could see what I was doing here.
Oh my God, yeah, she has like bad teeth. I
She
forgot.
does. She has bad teeth. I have terrible teeth. I didn't
Mm,
like get dental care as a kid, and so they're not great. I also made them both I don't honestly it's an exaggeration to say ugly. In my mind, they're just like interesting looking people, but I wanted them not to be like traditionally mainstream media versions of
mm,
hot people because I think wealth and attractiveness are so tied. Like a
yeah.
lot of beauty is just the privilege of having dental care, skin care, jobs that you work in Zors, dietary thing, access, like all this stuff that I was
Mm,
like, I grew up in rural Western Kentucky. I know what people look like there. I know
mhm.
why.
I'm glad you sort of cleared that up because the way I imagined them was also sort of, oh, they're ugly because, Opal would probably be very like skinny because she can't eat that much and like her
Yeah,
clothes are
because they have
probably
bad
bad.
diets and bad
Yeah,
lives. It's
yeah,
how it is. Yeah,
yeah.
that's what I very much think. And I am a little tired of, particularly in romantic. I read a lot of romance and I love romance very, very much. But one of the things I find a little bit exhausting about it is how everyone's outward physical perfection is just insistent. And I just feel like mid people fall in love too. I'm confused.
Yeah, yeah. And ugly people too.
They do. I don't know what to
Yeah.
tell you
Yeah.
guys.
Story of Opal. She struggles with sort of the feeling of being unworthy of better things. And first of all, that's a reality for many people in general. But sort of taking into account her situation, is anything you want to add about
Yeah.
sort of her journey, about self-worth and like breaking the cycle of struggle, which is and isn't truly broken by the end,
Yeah.
but
I mean, I feel a lot of different things. Obviously, there's some personal stuff there with of like if
mm,
when you grow up with certain economic expectations for your life, um, I at least spent a long time sort of resentfully being like, it's not that I'm not worthy, it's that I don't want those things anyway. I
mm,
don't want like screw that. And you get kind of a chip on your shoulder about it. But I also wanted her to be like, I mean, I don't know how to say this without it. I feel like people are very strange about the role of romance and how that relates to feminist themes. But I
mm,
do feel like my life is hugely defined by who I fell in love with. And
mm,
that like a lot of my self-worth and I don't know, the course of my life was in large part determined by the fact that I fell in love with a man who like saw my worth and like we could and believed in me in ways that I didn't believe in myself. And so it feels very natural to me to have like a an arc about self-worth also be about finding someone who values you. Like
mm,
falling in love is a significant part of the story. It was always partially a romance that baked into a gothic
mm.
fantasy.
The way people view you, and if you find people who are like, you are great because you are you,
Mhm.
helps with your worthiness.
Yeah, it just
Yeah,
does. It changes like how you see your own future is it
yeah.
and I just feel like, like the reality is that I never tried to write fiction until I'd met my husband. Like, and I wish I had been braver and all these things, but like I didn't start trying to write until I was like early 20s. And that was in large part because I suddenly I had more confidence and a more sense of my like own possibility in a way.
So Starling House is a novel, plays with the idea of who gets to tell the story and whose story are told and how the stories are told and erased and everything. Was it sort of a theme that shaped the narrative or a narrative that made the theme come up?
Yeah. No, the theme is of like what history is and who tells it, who controls
Hmm.
it, is the reason the book is structured this
Hmm.
way. So it has just, if you haven't read it, it has like a number of like, there's a lot of different versions of the history of Starling House that are retold throughout. And some of them are like official, like from Wikipedia. Some of them are a story she hears from somebody else in the town. Some of them are from primary sources, and that is largely the problem of me and that I have a history degree and then I went back and got a master's in history and I taught it for a while before I wrote and I just feel like one of the things that you very quickly realize when you're studying history is that there is no single narrative of it. And
Hmm.
there's no point at which you dig down and you're like, aha, I have revealed the real story, the one single true version of this. And in fact, what you're doing as a historian is taking all these very disparate versions of a narrative and trying to weave through them and find one single reality. And so I think that that is a fun thing to do from a historical perspective, and it's a fun thing to do with specifically the Southern Gothic, because if you read Southern Gothics, and I don't know how well this translates internationally, but there's some of them that are written by dominantly white men that
Hmm.
are very much about like the South is this beautiful thing that has now been lost and it's ruined, and they're very nostalgic about Southern history. And then there's a tradition of the Black Southern Gothic, which tells an
Hmm.
extremely different narrative about what the South is and has been and will be. And so I wanted a way to be like, this is a space and a history that is retold a bunch of different times with a bunch of different biases.
Honestly, I was really intrigued by sort of this aspect of the book and getting the story told again and again because you ended up, or at least like as a reader, I ended up always sort of looking for what new pieces of
Yeah.
information you get, um, or like how they are linked to the other versions of the story you already know. And
I
it
would
just,
say just structurally, it's not an amazing idea. If anybody is an aspiring writer to be like, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll write the same story like 8 times in this book. I'm sure people won't get bored. It was a real challenge to be like, I want to change it enough each time that it feels like,
Mhm.
ooh, I'm looking for new information, but also it has to be recognizably the same story. How many times can you get away without boring people? I don't know.
The funny thing is, I did a reread of it, but listened to it as an audiobook. In the actual like physical copy, you get, the bolded out title of "This is the story of,"
Hmm.
and it felt very sort of like we differentiate the stories from the big narrative, and
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
the audiobook, it's obviously like it just
It
sort
just
of
flows right in. Yeah.
to the story. So yeah, wait.
Yeah. My next book is going to be even more of a mess because the next one is like a time loop story. So you're traveling through time and you're
Uh,
repeating the same thing. So that one, I was like, why did I do this to myself? I have to replay like the same scenes with slight differences like 5 times.
although
It's
you have just now sort of erased the advice you have given.
I know. I know.
Like,
Don't
don't,
do what I'm doing. I don't know why I'm doing this.
like, don't write the same story, yet here I am.
And then the next book, I was like, I'm going to do it even more so. The whole story is going to
It's
repeat
just,
like five
yeah,
times. And it has a book within a book.
as always.
And it's written, and here's the worst piece of advice, and I wrote it in second person, like
Ah,
you, and I there's reasons I did all these things, but in retrospect, I was like, why did I do all these things?
I'm sure it will be all worth it.
We'll
But
see. Good luck to everyone.
although I do know that in the meantime there is a short story that's
Yeah, I
gonna.
have a short story that is not written as insanely that is coming out in March. And the book will be out in October in English.
So there's more stuff. I didn't even get to that question, but here we are.
Sorry.
Back to our story within a story that is Starling House. One of the many themes and things mentioned in the book are the sort of strong sense of destiny versus
Mm.
choice. So do you feel like we are shaped by the past, especially with the sort of historian background, or can we break free? Opal and her brother have these sort of like they really represent this
Yeah.
breaking away and then
I mean, there's two questions there. And okay, so one part of this, my concern with like, are you destined or chosen or fated versus like, is this your own choice? That's just an argument I have with the fantasy genre at large, which
mm-hmm.
has been so invested for so long in like chosen one narratives. And if not
Mm-hmm.
chosen one, this idea that like, there's a prophecy or there's because of who you're descended from, you have to
Mm-hmm.
do this
Mm-hmm.
X, Y, and Z. And I understand the appeal of those stories, and I've loved many of those stories, but I want in my books it never to be because of who you were born.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
chances of your genetics, you have to do any type of thing, which is the reason that like the Starlings as a family are not an actual genetically related family.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Mm-hmm.
important to me. Um, so that's just an argument I'm having with genre. But then the other part of it is like, how much does history shape our choices? And I always want it to be clear that history shapes our world and our society and our
Mm-hmm.
culture, but it doesn't limit our own individual agency. Like, I think agency is a really interesting thing to play with in fiction because I feel like readers very much want a protagonist who has a lot of agency, who is making
Mm-hmm.
choices that matter. Um, but then at the same time, I don't know, that those choices and that assertiveness is not always rewarded when your protagonist is not a man or a white man. So, like I've gotten a lot of sort of feedback and comments from people that Opal as a character is too rash, too angry, too bossy, like she's a little too much.
Mm-hmm.
And that was on purpose. She has a lot of
Mm-hmm.
agency in her life. She has a lot of agency in this narrative, despite the fact that her circumstances, her history, her gender limit a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm.
She actually can make a range of choices within that. Not all of which are good, but that's fine.
Yeah, there. That's not the point of agency. Yeah, I mean that was something I personally really liked about her. I too sometimes was quite sort of I despaired at what she did, especially because you got sort of the perspective of other characters,
Yeah.
so you could see how like what she was doing wasn't the best.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's frustrating. And I totally respect people who are like, I don't
yeah,
want to
yeah,
read a protagonist who's making these frustrating choices.
yeah.
I understand that, but I think that's just not compatible with my understanding of what a
Mm,
protagonist is and what they're doing. I think about this interview I listened to with George Saunders talking
mm-hmm,
about what makes a story, and he's just so smart and amazing. But he was like, to say once there was a very graceful man is not a story. The story is once there was a very graceful man who stumbled. That's
mm-hmm,
when you have a
mm-hmm.
story. And that's pretty much how I see like what narratives do.
As we're back to Opal, I have another question about her, and specifically now that we've gone to how she is all these things that people consider too much. I guess felt I don't know how much of that was like my own projection, but some female rage that's sort of simmering beneath the surface.
Mhm.
In Opal's sort of like anger and grief and like defiance, which fuel a lot of her journey, but also in E Starling and her journey and how they've like this female rage sort of leads them to very different outcomes in the
Mhm.
end. Was this intentional, and was it something you sort of wanted to give space to?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I think it's on purpose, but that is like I don't know. I'm growing up a woman in America. I just have a certain level of like
Yeah.
simmering resentment at all times. So it's not something I think I like sit down and I'm like, I want to really explore female rage. It's just kind of baked in there. But I did
Mm.
intentionally want it to be, and this is not a criticism, to be clear, of feminists and women's works that are sort of fueled entirely by resentment and anger. I think that can be a fun genre. It can be very cathartic. I enjoy that. But I wanted this to be a little bit more complex of a story where there's kind of the question of what you do with that rage and where that leads you. And if your entire identity becomes boiled down to what has been done to you and your victimhood and your resentments, then that limits you, that shrinks you actually. And that's just a sort of contention that I have with a lot of contemporary expressions of feminism that I feel like are less about building an identity around your strengths and more about building an identity around your victimhood. And I kind of wanted to be like, look at some possible outcomes of those
Yeah.
things. So not
Yeah.
to spoil anything, but that is, I thought a long time about who I wanted to be the villain in this story
Hmm.
versus who I wanted to be the antagonist. And like, not all of the well, yeah, I don't want to spoil it, but like I wanted some of the villainy to not be sort of the obvious culprits in the American South.
People will appreciate the actual villain of the story. I was stressed out by the presence all the time. And at one point, I was very annoyed that sort of this um, like layer of the story was added because I was like, I just want to enjoy the creepy. And
I
now there's
understand.
this,
I understand. And now we're upset. Now we're sad and we're thinking about the past. I understand. I
and now
do.
we have this like element
Yeah.
here that's
Mhm.
and it was interesting because the villain is not part of anything very gothic or
Yeah.
eerie, so it just came crashing in like, no, go away.
Yeah. Well, and I also wanted there to be like, I think that is part of being like fairly low in social status is that you will have multiple antagonists to your life. You will have like corporate forces that are crushing the life out of
Mhm.
you. In some ways, her manager at the Tractor Supply, like she works in retail, she's a cashier. That is one of the major antagonists in her life because they just
Yeah.
are trying to wreck you all the time, right? And it'll be like
Hmm.
this huge money interest, and it'll be like the past, and it'll be like your own mom. All of these things are going to be forces operating on you.
Opal's story also has and is, at least in the beginning, a lot about survival, but also the cost of it.
Mm-hmm.
And were there any moments in Opal's story that were hard for you to like write, walk through with her as the character?
Yeah, I mean, I don't I don't know. In a lot of ways, I feel like there is a certain distance between what I'm writing and me because I'm like trying so hard. I'm like doing the backstage work in the
Mm-hmm.
theater production, I'm like thinking about like pacing and structure and tone and like I'm all these other considerations to where I'm not always fully experiencing emotionally what's going
Mm-hmm.
on.
Mm-hmm.
But there's definitely the things that surprise you were the things that get you. Like I wasn't fully aware that I was writing about my a lot of my own personal feelings with my
Mm-hmm.
brothers until like some of their scenes came out, and I was like, oh, I've had this actual fight with I've had the same conversation before. Um, in terms of like the struggle of survival and how ugly that can get, I wanted it to both be clear that poverty is not the end of like happiness, like that she and her brother have moments of real joy and connection
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
safety in that hotel room. And it's like it doesn't look great from the outside, but I did want it to be clear that like the warmth and love and joy and humor, like all those things exist. Because I really tend to resent particularly Southern narratives that are just sort of grindingly sad, as if poor people are walking around just feeling the weight of their reality all the time. That's just not been true to my life. So I did want to balance those things.
Starling house, as the house itself was both a refuge but also like a danger. I mean, the way I worded this into a question is very wolf. Because I think, do you think that reflects how trauma and history live within us?
I mean,
But yeah.
yeah. I mean, no, actually what you said about how it's a refuge and it's dangerous, that's just how I feel about Kentucky. So I grew up in Kentucky. I'm from there. I love it very deeply. Both sides of my family are from there from way back. And I always kind of imagined that I would be one of the ones to sort of stay. And like just for
Mm-hmm.
international context, Kentucky is like deeply conservative, very poor, very rural. It's not necessarily easy to get by there, but I always was like, I will be one of the ones to stay and help make Kentucky better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I had children, and I was like, I have to get out. We have to leave, actually. And that's partly just because our political landscape has been getting darker and darker and darker and more violent. And I was no longer, I was like, well, my children won't be safe here. And
Mm-hmm.
that's true. And we left. Some of our friends left too, our queer friends, trans friends who are no longer safe in a place that I've grown up for generations, like the generations of my family are
Mm-hmm.
from. And so I wrote Starling House feeling homesick for a place that was dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And so the house itself became sort of a weird mix between the haunted houses of the Southern Gothic, which are frightening and scary and carry all the weight of our past, and the sentient, enchanted houses of fairy tales, which are like caretakers and friends. And, think
Mm-hmm.
about the
Mm-hmm.
castle in Beauty and the Beast. It's always
Yeah,
sort of a
yeah.
silent presence.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's both.
I did like how the end result is a house that is sort of sassy, haunts you, but it
It's
haunts
fine.
you in
It's a
a like
buddy. It's a haunted house that's like your little buddy. It's great.
yeah, that, like it will haunt you by making sort of the things you want to stay away from appear on your walls. Love how there's so many sort of things in this story. Like it's um again, the house is more than just a house, and I feel like this story is more than just a simple like gothic or it can't be like put into a box. I don't have anything specific to ask about Bev, and we'll meet Bev, but I really loved her and I really cheered for her at the end, and I understood the struggle she
Yeah.
had, but I was very sort of
Yeah, I loved writing Bev probably more than most of the other characters. Uh, and part of the reason she is there is that even as we were leaving Kentucky, because of the reasons I mentioned before, uh, I wanted it to be clear that, like, as much as you might imagine it, and Kentucky might imagine itself as a homogenous and heteronormative and white and whatever sort of a space where it's very everyone goes to church on Sunday. It's not actually true. Like
Mhm,
it's
mhm,
just not true. And like many of our queer friends are still there and have
mhm,
stayed in very rural spaces, and it has made them sort of beautifully tough in the way that Bev is.
So there's a question from one of our readers that I wanted to actually ask you. They ask, what is your favorite part of the writing process in
Whichever
general?
one I'm not doing. Whichever stage I'm not at, I'm like, oh, you know what's great? Editing is great. That's gonna feel wonderful once I get this first draft out of the way. And then I'm editing. I'm like, I don't know. I really feel like drafting. I had it open. No. I'm very whiny about writing. I'm very slow at it.
Mm,
I am definitely one of the people who likes having done it more than maybe actually doing
mm,
it. But honestly, the thing that I find the most where I get a real spark of joy is just when you are writing a sentence and it comes out right. And sometimes that is like the 18th time you've structured that sentence, but like something about the adverb surprises you or the structure of it, or there's a little joke in it somehow. And
mm,
I'm just like, oh, I love that. The kind of thing that, like, if you're reading, like, I love many, many types of books, but one of my favorite kinds is when you're reading and just on a sentence level, on a prose level, you will hit some little thing that you're like, oh, that's a killer. That's a banger. Like, and if maybe like twice a book, I feel like I get one of those and I'm like, oh, that
mm.
makes it all worth it. That feels so good.
I mean, I love when I get to hear authors talk about that because obviously as a reader you don't necessarily think about all that.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's more of if the story flows, you're kind
Yeah,
of
and
like,
it's such
woo.
a feeling. It's a when I read, I'm not, I'm not hopefully thinking about all these like technical craft questions and stuff,
Mm,
but it's such an emotional experience to read a book that you're like that you enjoy that it takes a lot of analysis afterward to be like, what made me feel that way? Why was
yeah,
that such an
yeah.
enjoyable?
The final thing I'm gonna ask is what do you hope readers take from Starling House? If there's a particular feeling or a message, or if there's anything you sort of want to stay with them when they're finished reading this story that's more than a story.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a single or an identifiable. I feel like if there's a single sentence message to your book, maybe you've messed up a little bit.
Fair,
Like, why'd
fair.
you write a book then? Because a book should be, I think, ideally kind of a series of like questions more than like specific
Mm,
answers. But I think what I hope you're thinking about when you finish it is I guess the concept of home and whether that is a warm and welcoming concept to you or a frightening one. I hope you find some sense of like either nostalgia for what you've lost or love for what you're building your new home.
I think people will, but thank you.